Hi everyone, it's me, Dr. Kate. I'm here with a brief lecture about your reading for Friday about what it means to be Undocuqueer. And I just wanted to highlight a couple things to keep in mind as you read the essay. Also, my cat wanted to say hi. Say hi, cat. Oh. Anyway, so a few things to highlight from this article. First, I want to talk a bit about the methodological approach that the scholars take in this piece. First of all, they use a framework that should be really familiar to you all by now, which is the framework of intersectionality. And they make the argument that when we talk about immigration or we talk about the issues facing undocumented people, if we don't think intersectionally, if we don't see how gender and sexuality shape the experience of the undocumented immigrant in the United States, that we miss a lot of the story about that experience. And why does that matter? That matters because if we're thinking about how to make equitable life for people, how to make sure that people don't face premature death based on where they're from or what what their gender sexuality is. If we care about that kind of justice, and if we care about equal access to life, then we need to pay attention to some of these differences that produce, when they're coupled with power, produce premature death for people. So if we care about stopping that, we have to care about the issues facing undocumented queer people in particular. So their methodology is a qualitative study, and they point out in their article that there's just not a lot of research about this issue and about these people. And a lot of that has to do with the multiple marginalized identities that they hold and how dangerous it is for these people to come out as undocumented and to come out as queer. So they're sort of in this kind of double bind that makes it very challenging to do research in the first place. So they do a qualitative study using a snowball sample, and they find interviewees through activist groups and then through Facebook, and this is called snowball sampling. Like I ask, you, and then you have friends who are like you, and so you ask them, and eventually we have a decent study. Then they code those interviews, and this methodology lets them see, are there themes that come up? Because as we've talked about before, everyone is a radical singularity. My experiences are just mine. They belong to just me. My life is very, very unique. And there's a social structure that's bigger than me that helps shape the kinds of experiences I can have, the language through which I can understand those experiences. And so you'll see similar themes emerging. And what the researchers are trying to do is find out from these folks, from their own voices, what are the issues that they face, and how can they be best understood if we want to sort of make a change and to enable their lives in better and important ways. So they find three themes that come out of their research, and all of them are about what they call illegibility. And they put the ill in parentheses because they want to draw attention to the fact that legibility is something that people might need for survival, but it is denied to these folks, and they are illegible in multiple ways. So the first way is that they are structurally illegible, meaning that they don't have any state protections. Now this is kind of an interesting point that your authors make. The state is often seen as the provider of certain kinds of benefits and safety nets, things like unemployment insurance, food stamps, Medicaid, Medicare. All of us living in the United States have been on the receiving end of some kind of state benefit at some point. If you grew up in a home owned by your parents, for example, the state gave them a financial benefit by giving them a tax break for their mortgage. If you are a child of parents who filed income tax return, the state gives a tax credit for each child, right? So these are examples of how state benefits citizens. Because they are undocumented, they are outside of being able to access those benefits. So they have no state protection. So they don't have the ability to use a social safety net, and they also don't have the ability to use the aspects of the state that can sometimes keep us safe, things like the police. Now, the other issue that's facing, the sort of other issue of structural intelligibility that's important here is that the state itself, the police, as an arm of the state, they actually make people, these folks, less safe. So they are themselves a source of violence. So not only is the state not a protector, but it is indeed a violator. And this is a really tough spot to be in. And then thirdly, in terms of structural illegibility, your authors talk about how the combination of anti-LGBT sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment come together to form a really extremely deadly kind of structural violence against undocumented queer people. And we understand where that anti-LGBT stuff comes from, right? Remember our discussion of the state's sort of constant criminalization and monitoring of queer people, and we're still doing this, right? The state is still debating whether or not companies should be able to fire people because they're gay. So this stuff's not over. The state, that part of what this is running through the state is an ideological sort of resistance to queer people. Right? So that violence is multiplied, and the structural intelligibility facing undocumented queer people is particularly strong. The second kind of unintelligibility that they talk about is embodied illegibility. And here is how they note that their respondents all talk about how the body itself is a medium on which is written the kind of violence that comes through structural illegibility. So, for example, their bodies are themselves always already seen as criminal. So this argument should sound familiar to anybody who's familiar with the arguments about racial profiling in the police, right? Anti-immigrant sentiment means that your brown skin puts you at risk always already of police violence. And this is not only through the racist actions of the individual immigration agent or something, but also it's worked into state law in a lot of places, right? So, for example, Georgia passed a law that said that anyone could be asked to show citizenship identification documents at any time for any reason. The chances that the Atlanta police are going to stop me and ask for those documents very, very slim, and that's simply because of the way that white privilege works. So on their bodies, because of their queerness and their brownness in kind of an in the context of anti-immigrant sentiment, means that their bodies are always already criminalized, and that they're, I might even argue that it's not that they're illegible, it's that they're hyper-legible, right? A kind of hyper-visibility, and the state violence comes down on these folks in really intense ways. The third kind of illegibility your authors talk about is illegible survival. And they talk about how difficult it is when you're undocumented to find work. And this theme, we've talked about it before, and it came up in the film that you watched as well. It's difficult to find work because you don't have a social security card. You don't have the citizenship documents that make you eligible for the kind of paid work that citizens do. So most of what folks can find is under the table work, and for a lot of people, it's sex work. And sex work, being engaged in sex work puts you at an increased risk of violence from the state. Policing comes down really hard on sex workers, and when you have so few choices for work, and that choice gets you in this kind of violent bind with the state, that's a really big issue. So these are the sort of main kinds of illegibility that the authors discuss in this piece that face undocumented queer immigrants. They end, though, they attempt to end, I don't know if it works, but they attempt to end on a slightly more hopeful note. And they talk about how undocumented queer people make meaning. they talk about the fight to find and make community with each other. And this is a theme that should be familiar from our viewing and discussion of Paris's Burning, the way that people were positioned in a relationship to the state and society where they're not meant to survive, how they survive anyway, right? How they make kinship systems and support each other. Your authors also talk in this section about how some undocumented queer people actually use their gender and sexuality for survival itself. So sex work, though it opens folks up to a different kind of state violence, also can be a mode of survival that they have access to. So rather than seeing undocumented queer people as powerless at the hands of the state, what I think your authors are doing is trying to say, okay, well, where are the moments of agency, right? Where is it when your back's against the wall, when there's so many forces aligned against you? How do you survive? Sometimes it's survival that is itself a kind of activist resistance, right? To survive in a world that does not want you to. And then they also talk about the resistance to the police state that undocumented queer people attempt to do. One of the things I find really interesting about the end of this piece is that they talk about how state movements to address the plight of undocumented people, particularly the DREAM Act, how Dreamers and the construction of Dreamers as like really, really good undocumented immigrants. Like they're innocent. They're kids. They didn't have any choice. They just want to go to college. That kind of construction of a kind of ideal figure of an undocumented immigrant actually pushes further out to the margins undocumented queer people who might not fit that sort of model immigrant myth that the DREAM Act comes up with. So I want to make a connection here back to Gail Rubin's article and her argument that we discussed earlier about the charmed circle and the outer limits. And there's a way as people enter that charmed circle, we can sort of use that metaphor again as dreamers, say, inch in closer to the charmed circle into a place where they're considered good members of society and closer to citizenship. It pushes the bad members further out. So undocumented queer people can be even further marginalized by things like the DREAM Act. So I just wanted to give this sort of brief lecture about that piece to sort of draw out some of the things I think are important. I hope you enjoyed's a weird word. I hope that you read it and learned some things from it. I think listening to the experiences of people who aren't who might have really radically different experiences from yours is really important to building empathy, but also to start thinking about what can we do to build a world we would want to live in, and that would be a safe place for undocumented queer people as well. All right, so I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to force this cat to say hi, because what's the point of an at-home lecture if you don't see a cat? So here's Cat, and we hope that you are having a good week. Bye.